this is going to be very difficult. And I think it is becoming difficult. I can see it in the expressions on some of your faces. Let me say it like this. There are no heroes here. You know, the lectures in the past have talked heroically about African Americans overcoming various situations. There is some of that here. There is certainly some of that here. But there is also much more contingency. There's also much more conflict. There's also much more angst about what's going on. There is no right answer. And that's, I think, that's what makes history itself so meaningful, because often there is no right answer. Often people can disagree fundamentally on various approaches. And let me say this, and I guess I should have added in the text of the lecture, because I sort of assumed that people knew a lot about this. It's essentially the split that's going on in the African American community, because this is what I'm focusing on. The split that's going on in the African American community is in some ways class-based. That is, that working class people, to some extent, are beginning to challenge middle-class activists who had dominated the civil rights movement. But it's also a split that's based upon a kind of ideology, an ideology around the notion of integration. There are a lot of people, there are a whole host of people who, through the civil rights movement, believed that integration was the panacea, that integration, the integration of society was the goal that we all should work for. And certainly that is a noble goal, that's a noble purpose. But increasingly, a number of African American activists, and we may not necessarily agree with them, a number of African American activists were saying integration is not the goal or should not be the goal should be freedom. The goal should be self-determination. The goal should be the ability for African Americans to control their destiny. If that comes through integration, then that's fine. If it comes through various other processes, then that ought to be recognized as well. Well, this was difficult. This was difficult for the integrationists to hear. It was difficult in some instances for those who were, I would call, anti-integration to make that case. And that made for very difficult situations in terms of the debates going on in the late 1960s. But as you're going to see in a minute, those debates would intensify in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. As I said before, there are no heroes here. But there is an attempt, an honest effort, there's an attempt by various factions of the African American community and various factions of the white and Asian and Native American communities to try to figure out what is in the best interest of the entire community. And there are fits and there are starts and there are attempts to try to move in various directions. All of it's, if you will, all of it's well-meaning, but all of it doesn't have the same impact. All of it doesn't have the same result. And in many instances, there will be people who will appear to be working at cross purposes in this effort. Let me talk about the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, because that's the era of busing. And folks, I can tell you right now, well, I don't need to tell you, busing was one of the most controversial, if not the most controversial issue in Seattle and in the country throughout the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Political careers were made on, if you will, the opposition to busing. All we have to do is think about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon comes to mind. But we also, all we have to do is think about Ronald Reagan, because and we may have forgotten this, but to a large extent, Ronald Reagan's appeal in a lot of areas of the country revolved around questions of race, and particularly his stand on busing. So what I'm going to explain to you here in terms of Seattle is the Seattle story, but we have to remember it's the Seattle story against the backdrop of a nationwide debate, a nationwide campaign that's going on about the issue of busing. The campaign about integration, or the end of de facto segregation in Seattle, did not begin in 1970. Indeed, as we've already established, there are echoes of that go all the way back to 1954. And it intensified in the 1960s, the late 1960s. As early as 1968, Forbes Bottomley, the first of many Seattle school district superintendents who would grapple with the question of race and education, said of busing, this is before Seattle had committed itself to busing for racial integration, quote, "Many authoritarian decisions will have to be made by the school board. If we're going to move ahead, I'm afraid it's going to have to be by that route. If we're going to move ahead, I'm afraid it's going to have to be by that route." He didn't know how prophetic he was. He didn't realize when he made that statement that busing would be the key to understanding the racial dilemma of Seattle through most of that time period. Yet I would submit to you that neither the African American community nor the rest of Seattle was ready for authoritarian decisions in that regard. And indeed, they would never prove to be completely ready to that. Black parents in the Central District began in 1969 the Central Area School Council. That school council was headed by Mrs. Jerry Ware. And she and others like her believed that Central District parents ought to take the initiative for improving the schools within their area. Not necessarily promoting integration, but for improving the schools within the Central District. They made the argument that with better teachers, with better curriculum, with better counselors, those schools would improve, the test scores of the kids in the schools would improve, and those schools would become effective agents in terms of delivering education. The Central Area School Council under Ware carved out a specific position whereby they were able to negotiate with the school board, remarkably, the placing of teachers in the Central District schools. They placed young white teachers and African American or minority teachers in the Central District schools, and remarkably, those schools began, or at least the kids, began to perform better. It seemed to some that this was an answer to the dilemma of education in the Central District. Ironically, though, even as Ware and others were beginning to tout this, there were others in the community, including others in the African American community, that were touting something else, that were saying improvements in the Central District schools are simply not enough, that you've got to integrate, that you've got to get the kids out of those predominantly black schools and in the schools across the city. Parents increasingly were interested in integrated education, but they disagreed on exactly how to bring that integrated education about. And those in the black community, or many in the black community, said, and I quote, "We don't want our children going to those white schools, especially when the schools here in the Central District are gaining in terms of quality education." These parents, in effect, wanted better education, and they felt that they had a solution to this. They felt that they had a way to bring this about. But regardless of what these black parents wanted, or regardless of the wishes of white parents or Asian parents, busing was coming. In September of 1972, a mandatory school desegregation program was instituted by the school board. It involved, at first, only 624 students. These students were chosen by computer, and they would, in effect, be bused across town to various locales outside of their neighborhood in order to promote what would be called racial balance. In other words, the idea was that by busing kids across town, they would help to affect or help to bring about quality education. There was opposition from the very beginning. On the day in which, the day before, or the night before, the busing program was supposed to begin in Seattle, approximately 75 buses had their tires slashed. In other words, vandals came in and slashed the tires of the majority of buses that were going to carry these students. In other words, Seattleites, or at least some Seattleites, were beginning to show their opposition to busing. But I would argue that despite the slashed tires, Seattle was hardly South Boston or Gage Park in Chicago, where riots broke out when busing programs began in the early 1970s. A lot of us perhaps don't remember this or don't recall this, but in the early 1970s, there was tremendous tension all over the country, certainly all over urban America, because of busing to bring about racial integration. Now, I would argue that there seemed to be less fundamental opposition to busing to integrate the schools in Seattle than in other cities. In places like Gage Park in Chicago, in places like South Boston, there was fundamental opposition to any effort to integrate the schools. In other words, it didn't matter if it was busing or anything else. In Seattle, I think increasingly parents said, we don't want our kids bused in order to bring about racial integration. And the way in which they touted their opposition was by withdrawing their kids, withdrawing their students from the schools. In other words, we see, beginning in 1972 and continuing throughout Well, throughout the 1990s, white flight. Look at these figures. These figures are dramatic. They show the declining enrollment of white students in the Seattle public schools. Now, I would be the first to argue that there are a variety of reasons for the declining enrollment. I would argue that Seattle families were becoming smaller. I would argue that there were growing numbers of people of color in the city of Seattle. But I think we can't get away from, as we look at these figures, we can't get away from the fact that a lot of parents, a lot of white parents, opted to take their kids out of school. You see, for instance, a concomitant rise, a dramatic rise in the number of kids in private schools, white kids in private schools. You also see many white parents essentially enrolling their kids in suburban schools, even though the parents remain in the city. The situation became so very difficult that the school board had to scramble to see how can we affect integration and at the same time keep white students in the school district. And in order to do this, they came up with what they felt was a novel device. They came up with the magnet schools. In other words, schools that would have superior programs that would hopefully hold the attention of white students and Asian students, as well as keep black students in the area so that integration could be effective. Cleveland High School in 1970, this is 1971, but Cleveland High School in 1972 had one of the first magnet programs. And anybody in here who's familiar with Garfield knows that Garfield is one of the exceptional places in terms of magnet schools. But there's a problem. The magnet schools, unfortunately, did not work. There was a tremendous amount of opposition to them. And let me suggest the various ways in which that opposition was going to be acted out. First of all, magnet schools, for all of their success, did not stop white flight. They did not stop white parents from taking their kids out of the school district. Secondly, magnet schools prompted fear on the part of black parents, especially in places like Garfield and in neighborhood junior high schools, where African Americans had been the majority. There was a fear that they would no longer be the majority. There was a fear that these would no longer be their schools. Now there's a paradox here. On one hand, integrationists are arguing we ought to close these schools down or we ought to get the black kids out of these schools and move them across town. But there was a lot of neighborhood pride in Garfield. There was a lot of neighborhood pride in Median. There was a lot of neighborhood pride in some of the other schools. And as bad as some of those schools appeared to be, there were a lot of black parents who said they at least are our schools. They at least are our schools. And so there was a conflict there. Thirdly, the ACLU and the NAACP, the chief proponents of mandatory busing, were very, very clear. They said the magnet schools undermine busing, undermine school integration. That is, as long as magnet schools were in place, that you couldn't have the full integration of the schools in Seattle. Then there's an extra element to come into play here. Asian parents in the International District were increasingly concerned and fearful that magnet schools would undermine the bilingual programs that they had worked for a number of years to try to bring about effective education for their children. But ultimately, the most important opponent to magnet schools in Seattle was the federal government. The most important opponent was the federal government. The government increasingly applied pressure on the school board to institute a mandatory busing program. The government argued that unless there's a mandatory program, funding could be cut off for Seattle schools, and there could be other legal action taken against the district. The board succumbed to that pressure, and in the spring of 1978, it voted to institute for the first time a mandatory busing program, despite the opposition of most of the city's white, black, and Asian parents. I want to emphasize this. Now, we usually think that black parents are in favor of busing, white parents are opposed to it. In this particular instance, the majority of parents of almost any race were opposed to busing. Regardless of whether they were opposed to it, busing came to Seattle. It came to Seattle without a court order, as one of the famous authors of the period wrote. But I would argue that it did not come without the threat of a court order. In other words, the pressure of the federal government forced the school board to call for busing. Now, white opposition, again, did not take the form of violent protests as in Boston and Chicago. However, the parents often voted with their children's feet In other words, they continued to see, the school district continued to see the decline in the number of students. I'm putting up here a statement by Charles Royer. Charles Royer, of course, was the mayor at the time, a mayor in 1980, and he's one of a number of politicians that remarkably attempted to try to deal with this situation. Royer offered leadership, but unfortunately it was a leadership that fell on deaf ears because there were so many people of various political persuasions who were increasingly opposed to busing. Let me give you an example of the opposition to busing. Franklin High School, for instance, in 1978, was supposed to receive 500 white students from the North End as part of the busing program. In other words, white students would be bused into Franklin High School. Only 250 came in the first 3 months, and by the end of the year, less than 100 were coming. Many of those students who dropped out of this program eventually ended up in private schools or elsewhere. Ironically, and there was all kinds of irony here in terms of the busing situation, ironically, white flight actually created spaces in North End schools. For instance, Roosevelt, because it lost so many white students, now could take a growing number of black and Latino and Asian students. Yet at the same time, the schools in the South End were growing by leaps and bounds. In other words, they were getting increasingly crowded because more and more Asians were coming to the city of Seattle. If the opposition to busing in the 1970s had been most pronounced in the northern end or at the north end of town, by the 1980s, it shifted to the South End. By the 1980s, black and Asian parents noted that their students, their children, I should say, their children comprise a disproportionate number of people who were bused. In other words, it's not just the fact that busing is taking place, who is carrying the burden of the busing? A lot of these black and Asian parents would argue that increasingly effectively. The school board claimed, and I think they were correct in this, that there were more vacancies in the North End schools, and therefore black and Asian kids should be bused to those North End schools. Yet the parents argued, and I think equally correctly, that the money that was spent on busing should have been spent on equalizing facilities. Case in point, musically inclined students at Roosevelt High School could choose from among a number of options. They could either take jazz choir, they could take concert band, they could take classic or concert orchestra, they could take concert choir, among other programs. Those students who went to Rainier Beach High School had one option, generalized music instruction. Folks, and I did some checking on this, that's the situation right to this day. That is the situation right to this day. While busing advocates claimed that the disparity vindicated their support for busing, a growing number of parents wondered if this was the only way to achieve quality education. Among black parents, increasingly class differences mattered. In other words, middle-class black parents supported busing. They almost adamantly supported busing, even when they themselves were taking their kids out of the public schools and increasingly enrolling them in private schools. Community leader Elmer Dixon reflected the growing difference of opinion in the black community when he said, quote, "No one asked the black community what they thought about busing. The leadership just picked it up and they started running with it." And this is a statement that applied not only to 1985 when he uttered it, it applied to 1965, 1966, 1967. The busing controversy had always moved strangely, almost unpredictably through the city's history. Now it took yet another ironic turn. As African American students comprise a growing percentage of the total school enrollment, the influence of black parents and black education experts and advocates grew proportionally. By 1984, 3 African Americans, T.J. Vassar, Michael Preston, Jerry Salter, were all sitting on the school board out of a total of 7 members. In other words, African Americans had disproportionate power on the school board at that moment, precisely because busing had in effect removed a lot of white parents from the discussion of and interest in those schools. Yet also by 1984, only a handful of schools in Seattle remained racially segregated. In other words, in 1984, it seemed that the busing advocates had achieved what they wanted. It seemed finally, although in some ways sort of incidentally and ironically, because of the large number of white students who have been removed from the system, it seemed finally that integrated education had been achieved. But had it? One of the promises, perhaps the promise of integrated education, was the fact that it would improve the quality of instruction for African American students, and as a consequence, African American student test scores would improve. In other words, why integrate if it's not to make sure that there's a better education? Why integrate if not to ensure that black kids get equal educational opportunities and they grow with those opportunities? Unfortunately, though, by 1985, I want to go to this next image, and I'm sorry, it's going to be hard to read this. By 1985, even though integration, quote unquote, had been achieved, the Seattle School District reported that there was an education gap, that there was an achievement gap. And those are words that ring true even to this day. We are still talking about, unfortunately, the achievement gap. Let me give you the figures. In 1985, according to the school district, fewer than 1 in 5 black students in grades 9 to 12 carried a grade point average of C+ or better. Latino and Native American students had similar scores, yet blacks were about 25% of the enrollment in the public schools of Seattle at that time. In contrast, 54% of white students and 67% of Asian students earned a C+ or higher. In other words, the achievement gap had become real. At the moment when we were concerned about busing, at the moment when we were concerned about making sure that students would sit in integrated classrooms, we had forgotten about the whole purpose of education, which is to educate. School board member Michael Preston was the first to break ranks from the old alliance that had talked about, that had pushed for busing. He said that it's now time to place less of a priority on school desegregation and a higher priority on quality education for African American students. He was immediately attacked. He was immediately attacked. Oscar Eason publicly declared that Preston was, quote, the best friend that the segregationists ever had, unquote. I think that's unfair, but nonetheless, it speaks to the growing divisions, it speaks to the growing tension within the African American community about the issue of busing. This is Lacey Steele. Lacey Steele was the president of the Seattle NAACP at the time. Lacey Steele vowed to fight for busing even if it meant promoting busing in those neighborhoods that were already racially integrated, prompting one WAG to say, it seems that now busing is the goal more than quality education. You can see Steele's comment here. Nonetheless, by the